everyone, it's Nina and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be doing a video I definitely have seen other booktubers do in the past, and that is kind of a review of every single book I have given 5 stars. I'm definitely a very stingy 5-star awarder. I really try to only give 5 stars to books that I love and I think I will love for years to come. But I kind of wanted to go through all of the 5 stars that I have as a way to kind of like show my favorite books of all time, and also maybe to reassess if I still like those books as much as I did when I first read them. So that is going to be the plan for today. We're going to be doing this in a tier list format. So with that intro out of the way, let's go right into the video and talk about the tiers on my list. So let's go through all the different tiers I have. The first one is 6 stars, and these are basically like my all-time favorites. They're not just like 5-star books, they're 6-star books. Next on the list we have I Stand By It, and these are books that I do think, yes, deserve to be 5 stars. Next one down is She's Cute, and these are ones that I do think are 5 stars, but they're not really like the first ones I think of when I'm running down a list of my favorite books. They're sort of like a second shelf down of my favorites. The next one we have is the perfect niche combination of my interests. So these are kind of like the books that I love them for things that are very specific to me, beyond if the book is like good on its own. And I'll probably mention a couple of those like very niche things that I really like in books when I get to the books that I'm gonna put in this category. Below that we have Hear Me Out. I wasn't sure if I wanted to call this tier Hear Me Out or You Had to Be There. These are books that I don't really think necessarily might be great on their own, but there's something about reading them at the time that I read them that really hit in the moment. And then the last tier I have is What Was I Thinking? And these are books that I'm kind of am like, actually, maybe I don't like them as much as I did when I read them. And they probably would be lower as like a 4-star if I read them now. Okay, we have 29 books to talk about here. So let's go right ahead and dive into the tier list. I'm gonna make myself smaller and put the tier list as like the main portion of the screen. So let's go ahead and get right into it. Okay, so here is all the books that we're going to be rating for this video. I don't have these in any particular order, so I'm just gonna kind of like jump around a little bit as I decide to sort through them. First of all, I have both of the books that I have rated 5 stars from Amanda Montell. First one is Cultish and the second one is Word Slut. I think both of these are in I Stand By It. I really loved both of these, and they were definitely favorites of the year in 2023 and 2024 when I read them. In talking a little bit more about Cultish and Word Slut, the focus I feel like a lot on feminist topics from a sociolinguistics perspective. Both of these books I thought were really interesting, and I definitely tabbed a lot and had a lot of like bookmarks when I was reading them. So yes, I definitely stand by both these books being 5 stars, and I've recommended them I think a lot on my channel. The next books I have to talk about are the 2 books I've given 5 stars in the Abhorsen/Old Kingdom series by Garth Nix. So we have the first book, Sabriel, and then the third book, Abhorsen. And I'm not really sure where I would put both of these. I like both of them a lot. I think Sabriel is going to go in I Stand By It, and then Abhorsen is in She's Cute. To be honest, I just like that series overall a ton. I think I was really struck by how much I enjoyed Abhorsen because I was listening to the audiobook for the first time when I read that book, but Sabriel I had read previously back in like middle school, and then reread it again in I think 2020 or 2021, and it just kind of continued to cement that it's one of my favorite fantasy series. To give a quick summary of the Old Kingdom series, these are necromancy-based YA fantasy that focus on a family line called the Abhorsens, who instead of a traditional necromancer who like brings things out of death, their job is to send undead things back into death and to stop like rogue evil necromancers from wreaking havoc on the kingdom. I think honestly all of these books are really good, so maybe they could all stand in the same category. But when I think of like my favorite of the series, it's probably going to be Sabriel. Okay, next book I'll have on this list is Sell Out by Dan Ozzie. This is a nonfiction book that focuses on quite a few bands in the like early alt-rock, punk, and emo scene, and kind of their transition from before when they were independently producing music to when they were then signed by a major label and had their big break, and then them kind of navigating the field of being a sellout. I thought this book was really engaging and super interesting when I was reading it. However, I don't necessarily know if it's held as much weight in my brain now, like over a year later since I've read it. Some of the bands, especially in like the second half of the book, I definitely don't remember that much about them. And it maybe got like a little bit repetitive overall because there were just so many bands that were focused on in this book. However, I did really like it, and I like the writing style and kind of the overall message of it. So I'm gonna put this one in She's Cute. Okay, then I'm gonna grab the 2 volumes I've given 5 stars in the Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation. And unfortunately, because I've read a lot of these volumes, it's seemingly back to back. I kind of don't remember exactly what happens in the 3rd volume versus the 4th one. I think I like the 3rd one probably the most out of all of them. Honestly, to the tier that I would give it 6 stars. I really love the Grandmaster Demonic Cultivation series overall. And then the second one, I probably would just do in a classic I Stand By It. Actually, I think this is more of like a She's Cute, even though I really, really like both the books in this series. The fourth one definitely, I think, leans into some elements of Wei Wuxian and Lan Wangji's relationship that I don't really like as much. Whereas, like, I really, really like everything that happens in the third and fourth volume that focuses on Wei Wuxian's background as the Yiling Patriarch. So those elements are definitely my favorite part, and probably the reason why I'm putting 3 in like the 6-star category as like one of my all-time favorites. To give a summary about what this series is about, the Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation by Moxiang Tongshu, or MXTX, is a danmei, or Chinese boys' love, and it follows our main character Wei Wuxian, who is the Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation, or the Yiling Patriarch. He is this incredibly powerful and feared figure back when he was alive, but at the start of the story he has been dead for several years already. But he is reincarnated into the body of this random guy who sacrifices his soul so that Wei Wuxian can live again. In this new body, Wei Wuxian is planning on just like laying low, but he ends up running into someone he knew from his past life, who is Lan Wangji. They kind of had a very strong like rivals to lovers energy going on, and they end up teaming up together to work on this kind of like murder mystery situation that's taking the cultivation world by storm. So the third one is definitely going to be a like 6-star for me, but I don't necessarily like the fourth one enough to not even really consider it being a full 5 stars. It's probably more closer to like a 4.75, 4.5 stars if I was going to like really, really be pressed on it. Okay, the next book I have on this list is Silver Unto Nightfall by Rin Chupeco, who, if I've talked about it at all on this channel, you know that it's one of like my favorite books of all time. It's obviously a 6-star, probably like the most 6-star, honestly, out of all of these 6 stars I'm going to list here. And Silver Unto Nightfall is an adult vampire-focused romantasy that follows our main character, Remy Pendergast, who is a vampire hunter called a Reaper. Remy is very much ostracized by the other Reapers in his organization because of a rumor that he might be half vampire himself. And throughout this book, Remy ends up working with these 2 vampires that are a couple that are both the heirs of the 3rd and 4th vampire courts. And as the story progresses, ends up joining them as kind of like a third in their throuple. I love this book so much. I love Remy as our main character. He has a lot of trauma that he's going through throughout the majority of this book. And his like growing bond with Xiaodan and Zidan, his 2 romantic love interests, are so good. I feel like this book also just has like the perfect balance of like action, lore, romance, good dialogue scenes. Everything just like really feels like it's in the right place. I do think the end is a little bit rushed, but it doesn't really bother me that much with the way that things get resolved. And I think it carries over enough like tension and angst for the second book in the series. So I just like really love this book overall. Okay, next book we have is Mockingjay. I'm gonna put this in I Stand By It. I do really, really love this book, and it made me cry. Even knowing like everything that was going to happen from seeing the movies, it just really, really hit me when I was reading it. I feel like this book could grow to be a 6-star book as I like engage even more and more with the Hunger Games series, with the new ones coming out, and eventually probably like rereading the original trilogy in the future. But for right now, it's a 5-star. I completely stand by it. I think Suzanne Collins just like kind of can do no wrong. Her books always just like hit everything perfectly. Okay, the next book we have here is The Song of Achilles. This is another 6-star read. I really, really love this book. I actually just reread it in December of 2024, and reading it a second time even more strongly like cemented in my mind how good this book is. Originally when I read it, I had actually listened to it as an audiobook, but this time I read it strictly just like physically reading it and tabbing and like annotating in the copy I have. And there were so many lines that I guess I missed in the original narration that were so incredibly just like beautifully written. This book is kind of like my Roman Empire. I think about it constantly. I think constantly about what it would look like if this book was made into a like TV miniseries. Like, what are the scenes that they would include in that TV miniseries? So yes, really, really love this book. Again, highly, highly recommend it. It is one of those very classic and famous like book talk books, but it's definitely one that is completely deserving of all of the hype. Okay, I think going from there, I'm going to actually talk about Circe by Madeline Miller. I'm gonna put this one in I Stand By It. Again, Madeline Miller is an amazing writer. All her books are so beautifully crafted. Circe I really love specifically actually for the ending. I think it's just like such a beautiful and poignant ending. So perfectly encapsulating everything that goes throughout the entire story. I really like also that it's kind of almost like recreation of the Telegony, which is the lost 3rd part of the epic cycle by Homer. I highly recommend this one as well. Okay, we're hitting another banger, which is The Secret History, which I am not really sure if I would put in 6 stars or I stand by it. I'm going to put it on I stand by it for right now. However, I think this could move up to be a 6 stars. I was kind of planning on doing a reread of this in December as well, but just kind of like ran out of time. So I think I'm going to put it in I stand by it for right now. If you haven't heard of The Secret History, this is another, I think, very popular like book talk book that is also like the mother of all dark academia novels that follows a group of like very prestigious ancient Greek students at this college. It's more so a like why done it that leads up to this one character's death. I think it's really, really good. One thing I think that's very underrated and when people talk about it is I find it to be very funny. It is a very like dry sense of humor, and the audiobook narration that is done by the author Donna Tartt kind of like really hammers that home. This is another book like Song of Achilles that I constantly think about that they would include in like the TV show or movie adaptation of this book. And I just really, really enjoy it. Definitely another one I have to reread in the future. Okay, next book we have on here is Darius the Great Is Not Okay by Adib Khorram. I'm going to put this one in the perfect niche combination of my interests. This one specifically, for the most part of the book, it's definitely like a 4-star. But I would say maybe like the last fourth or last third of the book is what really like pushed it into a 5-star. I feel like it was one of the very first books that I like was fully crying, like sobbing when I was reading it because of a very niche thing I've realized about myself, which is that I get very emotional whenever there is like a parent that's crying while their child is like in the same room as them. I just really enjoy in general when there's a lot of like emotional vulnerability of a parent when interacting with their child. And this book definitely had that and was the thing that like really pushed this over into being a 5-star for me. Okay, next book we have on this list is The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue. This is another 6-star read. It's the one of the books that I say is like my favorite book of all time. However, I definitely need to do a reread of this one soon, because the first and only time I've read it was in 2021. So it's going on like 4 years since I've read it. However, I love it so much. This is a YA historical queer romance that follows our main character Monty, who is going on a tour across Europe with his best friend Percy, who he's secretly been in love with his entire life, as well as his younger sister Felicity. And they kind of get wrapped up in this larger plot with like a magical MacGuffin. There's a very light fantasy element. I think this book is really, really well written. I really like Monty as the main character. I do think your mileage may vary in terms of how much you like this book, because I think a lot of people find Monty to be quite annoying. However, I think all of his like annoying traits and how like self-centered and kind of the way that he doesn't care about other people is part of like his development throughout the entire story. And I just really like it. I think the ending is really perfect as well. So yes, this book is another favorite of mine. Definitely one I need to do a reread of in the future. Okay, next one we have on here is The Vampire Lestat. I'm going to put this one in... Oh, I really don't know. I love The Vampire Lestat. It is like very long. I think that's one of the both good things about it, but maybe a little bit of its flaws. I might put this in the perfect niche combination of my interests, just because of how much I love Lestat's character. This book also in some ways has a little bit of like nostalgia for me in the fact that I read it back in high school. Although when I think about reading this book, I'm like, did I read it back in high school? Because there were so many things I forgot about in my reread that I did in 2023. Anyway, if you're not familiar with this book, it is the sequel to Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice, and it follows Lestat, who is a vampire turned in the 1700s in France. And it just kind of like basically chronicles his entire life story, his time living in Paris, the eventual like fledgling vampires he makes of his former lover Nikki, as well as his own mother Gabrielle, his kind of like beef with this other vampire coven that's in Paris, and then him like traveling across the world with his mother and learning the history of like the entirety of the vampire race. I really, really like this book. It's the only one of the Vampire Chronicles books I've given 5 stars so far, because I feel like this one is like the most cohesive in the narrative structure and like everything that we learn throughout the book. Like I said before, it is quite long, so I do feel like in general all the Vampire Chronicles books takes me a while to read because they are just like so immersive and descriptive. Anne Rice can go on for like pages and pages just describing like the scenery, but I feel like at least this one is not as bad as some of her other books in that like very like overly descriptive element. And I just feel like the development of Lestat's character and his relationships with the side characters are really good in this one. So yes, I'm gonna put this in perfect niche combination of my interests. But I honestly feel like I do also stand by it. And I just like in general really like the Vampire Chronicles books that I've read so far. Okay, the next one we have is Carrie Soto is Back by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I am going to put this one in She's Cute. This is one of the like kind of like fake celebrity books that Taylor Jenkins Reid has become known for. And I really, really enjoyed this one. I just really enjoyed overall the character arc that our main character, Carrie Soto, goes on. I really like the relationship she has with her father, and the romance she has with Bo, I think is really, really cute. And just like overall the lessons and everything learned in this book, I really, really enjoyed. However, it's not really one that I talk about very much on my channel. It's very much outside of my comfort zone because I don't really like sports, and I also don't really read a lot of like general fiction. But I do really enjoy this one, and it's made me honestly like more hopeful to read more Taylor Jenkins Reid books in the future. Okay, the next book I'm going to have here is House of Castle. This one is definitely, I stand by it. I think it's great. I think it's so fun. I really, really like the audiobook. This is a like almost kind of children's classic that if you've watched the Ghibli movie, you know the general gist of the plot. It follows our main character Sophie, who is cursed to become an old woman, and she seeks out the wizard Howl, who lives in a moving castle along the edges of her town. While she's there, she makes a deal with the fire demon that lives in Howl's castle named Calcifer. The biggest difference is that this does kind of like divulge in plot from the movie, with having the Witch of the Waste much more as like the main villain, versus in the movie it's much more the impending war that is going on. Anyway, I really like this book. I like all of the added details in the book version that are left out of the movie that I think are really, really important for like developing Howl as a character. I also like that he's even more of like a failwife and pitiful in the book compared to his movie adaptation, who seems a lot more suave and like put together. And I just prefer more of a pitiful man. I also enjoy Sophie more as a character in the book versus the movie adaptation as well. Okay, the next book I have on here is The Little Prince. I'm gonna put this one in 6 stars. This is a children's classic about the little prince who is an alien that lands on Earth and meets the narrator, who is a man that has crash landed his plane in the desert. Him and the little prince become friends, and the little prince kind of like tells his whole story of how he's traveled across the cosmos, meeting a bunch of like quirky characters and giving a lot of different like life lessons. This book is really cute and it's very nostalgic for me. I first read it when I was in middle school, and then read it again as like a book we read in French for my French class in high school. I just feel like I've become very connected with the story over the entirety of my life, and I think it's really, really good even now. I read it again for the first time in a couple years last year in 2024, and still really, really enjoyed it. Okay, next book we have on here is Dune by Frank Herbert. I am going to put this book in What Was I Thinking?, which might be a little bit shocking. This is definitely one of the first books I read when I got back into reading in 2020. Honestly, actually, the reason why I started reading again was because I wanted to try and read the Dune novels before the movie adaptation came out. And while I did enjoy this book at the time, I think since it was one of the very first books I read after having not read it for many years, I was a lot more lenient in giving 5 stars, which is why I gave this one 5 stars. That being said, I do really, really enjoy this book. It probably would still be like a 4-star if I read it again. However, I think the writing style is a little bit hard to get into. The kind of more like a third-person omniscient narration takes some getting used to compared to a lot of the more like modern books that I read. And while I do enjoy this book, I actually really dislike the other 2 books in the Dune series that I read. I still might be willing to read them again in the future, or maybe read some more of like the spin-off novels that have been written by Frank Herbert's son. But overall, I just don't necessarily think this series is for me. I'm gonna grab actually the other like book that I would consider like the What Was I Thinking category, and that is Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe. I really enjoyed this book while I read it. However, shockingly, I think one of the reasons why I liked it was because I feel like the humor was really well developed in the audiobook narration by Lin-Manuel Miranda. And since then, I have read a lot of other like queer YA books that I don't necessarily know if I would count this as like one of my all-time favorites. Again, probably another book I would put in the like 4-star, 4.5-star category. Next book I have here is The Lawrence Brown Affair by Cat Sebastian. This is another perfect niche combination of my interests, specifically because of the character Lawrence. This is a queer historical romance set in around, I think, like 1815. That follows our main character Lawrence, who is the Earl of Radnor, who is convinced that he is going to go mad and has just like kept himself locked up in his family's ancestral home to run science experiments. However, his quiet, lonely life is interrupted when he meets Georgie, who says he is coming on to be his new secretary. But in reality, Georgie is a con man who is on the run when one of his former associates is trying to kill him. And he thinks by lying low in the countryside, he will be able to kind of like figure out a plan to eventually then return to London. However, he was not anticipating to fall in love with his new employer. this is a book that is in the perfect niche combination of my interest category because of how like autistic coded Lawrence is. And I just really love his relationship with Georgie and all of the things that Georgie does to kind of make Lawrence's life easier. Not necessarily to try and like erase any of the things that he has about his personality, but just kind of help him adapt to the world around him. And I just think the relationship is so beautiful. This book also, I didn't realize it would be something I really, really enjoyed, but Lawrence is also a single father, and I feel like the single father trope done in this book is so, so good. And just like overall, I was very enamored with this book when I was reading it. Okay, the next book I have here is Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. I'm gonna put this one in Hear Me Out. You just had to be there. So many people like love this book. It's another book that got like super popular through Book Talk. I'm gonna put this in Hear Me Out because I really, really have a lot of love and like adoration for the fandom. I think it's really beautiful that so many people love this book. However, it's definitely not a book that, at least for me, I have a lot of like deep thoughts about. I just really enjoyed my time when I was reading it. I think the audiobook narration is really good. I think it's really well written and has a lot of like additional stuff going on, which is kind of like an essential part for me to like a contemporary romance. However, I think just I'm not as into it as a lot of other people are, so it's kind of gonna go in like one of the lower categories. I still think it is a 5-star, and I do recommend it as a like TikTok book that is worth it. Okay, next book I have here is Gideon the Ninth. This is going to go in another 6-star read for me. This is the first book in the Locked Tomb series by Tamsin Muir that are sci-fantasy hybrids, roughly described as being lesbian necromancers in space. This book here was the one that like kind of like started my love for this series that has grown to be like one of my favorite series like overall, and it's definitely one that a lot of like my entire friend group has gotten into together. So I just feel like for those added elements, I really, really love this book. For the book, like kind of on its own, I really, really like Tamsin Muir's writing style. This book is less like artistically different compared to her other ones, where she plays a lot more with structure and perspective. But I still can see all of like the quirky elements of her writing style come through very strongly here, which I really, really enjoy. Next book we have down here is The Last Olympian, which is the last book in the Percy Jackson series. I'm gonna put this one in I Stand By It. This is another book that made me cry at the end, specifically in the scene where they say the title of the book, The Last Olympian, and kind of like what that scene represents for the series overall in like really hammering home the message. However, I think this book, I'm putting it kind of next to Mockingjay because while it made me cry and I really, really think it's a good ending place for the series, I don't necessarily think it's like one of like my all-time faves yet. If I eventually like reread the Percy Jackson series or reread this book in the future, I think it would eventually move up to be like one of like my all-time faves. But for right now, it's just going to live in the other like solid 5-star book category. Okay, next book we have here is House of Hollow. I'm going to put this book in She's Cute. This is definitely my favorite YA horror book out there. And I thought it was going to be a book that would kind of like kick off my love of the YA horror subgenre. However, I just don't necessarily think it did because no other book has really lived up to this book's hype, at least in my mind. Even Crystal Sutherland's other book that she came out with in 2023, The Invocations, I didn't like as much as House of Hollow. So I just kind of feel like it represents more of like a flash in the pan interest where I really, really enjoyed this book specifically, but the subgenre as a whole, I just like haven't enjoyed as much. So I feel like for that reason, because it is kind of like more of an anomaly in my reading history as like other books that I've given 5 stars, but it's still a really good book and one I highly recommend. Okay, next one we have here is The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. I'm going to put this alongside Mockingjay. I'm not 100% sure if I would consider this better or worse than Mockingjay. They're very much on equal ground in my mind. I think Mockingjay can be a little bit slow in like the middle section, whereas The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes is kind of like a slow build up throughout the entirety of the book. But I thought it was just like the perfect villain origin story. Snow is even like more of a bitch in the book adaptation compared to the movie, if that is even possible, and I actually really enjoyed reading from his perspective. Okay, we're almost done. We have a couple more books to add. The first one here is Don't Want You Like a Best Friend by Emma R. Albin. I'm going to put this again in the perfect niche combination of my interests. This is a queer historical romance set in the 1850s that is about 2 best friends that are trying to kind of like parent trap their parents that are both widowed, who previously were in a relationship when they were younger, to then get back together so that the 2 girls will not have to find husbands during the season. And in the process, they become best friends and then eventually fall in love. I really like this book because of the dynamic and like all of the like outer stuff in the world building for like the reasons why the two girls feel the pressure to eventually get married. Specifically with the character of Beth, and kind of like the fact that her family is close to ruin if she doesn't secure a good match. But then also like the great feeling of loss that she has at the possibility that she'll be separated from the person that she's actually in love with. I just feel like there was a lot of like really good elements that really hit hard, specifically if you are a queer woman. But I feel like this book was able to also balance that like absolute pain with a lot of like more lighter scenes that were more like fun and fluffy. Overall, I just really enjoyed this book. I wasn't as much of a fan of the sequel book in the series, but this one I think stands perfectly fine on its own. Okay, next one we have here is Iron Flame by Rebecca Yarros, which is the sequel to Fourth Wing. I'm gonna put this one in Hear Me Out. Unlike most people that read Iron Flame, I really like this book, even more than Fourth Wing. Both these books are part of the Empyrean series, which, if you've been living under a rock, is a set of Dragon Rider-focused romantasy novels. And I just really love this one because I feel like it took all of the things I liked about Fourth Wing and like dialed it up to 11. I also feel like it cut right to the chase. Whereas Fourth Wing, I feel like I didn't really enjoy the first like fourth of the book before Violet has her dragon. I feel like this book helped me develop my love for all of the side characters even more, which I feel like is really essential for a like long-term series, to love not just the main character or the main couple. And it's also essential in a series like this where you need to like love all of the side characters for their eventual deaths to make even more of an impact. Okay, and the last book I have here is Belladonna. I am going to put this book in perfect niche combination of my interests. For a while, this book honestly could have been a 6 stars, but for how much I dislike the other 2 books in the series, it's gonna live down here for right now, because I think that this one is kind of like a flash in the pan, focusing on things that I really like in the context of Belladonna, but have not really worked when I've tried to take those into other series. This is a YA fantasy romance that follows our main character Signa, and she is an enemies to lovers romance develop with the personification of death. I really love Signa and Death's relationship. I love the development of their romance throughout the story. I think this book kind of falters in the like murder mystery element that they're going for. However, I think there's enough vibes in this book, as well as the romance being really good, that I was able to kind of like overlook some of the other flaws in the overall world building or plot stuff that I just didn't really focus on, that made me want to give this book 5 stars when I initially read it. However, having read the other 2 books in this series, I definitely think this one is the best out of all of them. And the books definitely go down in quality the further you go in the series. So for those reasons, even though it is a good niche combination of my interests, with this like Death and the Maiden type romance, I just don't feel like it really carries over well into other books in this subgenre, or even with the other books in the same series. Okay, with that out of the way, this is a look at my completed tier list. And that is going to be it for this video. These are all of my favorite books, the books that I've given 5 stars over the last like 4.5 years I've had of reading, and I hope to add many more books to this list in years to come. If you guys enjoyed this video, consider liking, commenting, or subscribing if you aren't already. If you've read any of the books I featured in this list, I'd love to hear your thoughts on them in the comments down below. And that is going to be it for me today. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye!